I had barely taken a breath since they lowered Edward into the ground. The funeral home's lobby felt too warm, the air thick with the scent of lilies and something heavier finality maybe. I stood there in my black dress, the one Edward had always said made me look dignified, and the pearl pendant he'd given me for our 40th anniversary rested against my collarbone like a weight. My feet ached from standing through handshakes and condolences, my cheeks still damp from tears I couldn't seem to stop. People had told me the service was beautiful, that Edward would have been proud, and for a fleeting moment, I'd felt surrounded by kindness. But kindness doesn't last long in certain families. I saw them before they saw me. Gregory, my son, tall like his father but with a stiffness in his shoulders that didn't belong to Edward, and Vanessa, perfectly put together as always, her blonde hair swept into an elegant chignon, her black dress likely worth more than my monthly grocery budget. Flanking them were two men in expensive suits, their polished shoes gleaming even under the dim lights. Gregory's eyes found mine, and his expression was one I'd come to dread over the past decade. Calculated, impersonal, already decided. "Mom," he said. His voice clipped but loud enough to draw a few curious glances from nearby guests. "These are Dad's attorneys. We need to talk." My fingers tightened around the tissue I'd been holding since the service started, crumpling it into a damp ball. I glanced between the two men, neither of whom looked familiar, and something twisted in my stomach. We'd always used Cynthia Harper for legal matters. Edward trusted her implicitly. Attorneys? My voice came out rough, the grief still raw in my throat. This can't wait until tomorrow? Vanessa stepped forward with the kind of confidence that only comes from knowing you have the upper hand or believing you do. "Margaret," she said with a tone that was almost sympathetic if you didn't know her, "I know this is difficult, but these matters are time-sensitive. Edward made some important changes recently." She placed a manicured hand on Gregory's arm, the gesture proprietary, as if she owned the moment. The conversation, maybe even him. The taller of the two lawyers cleared his throat. "Mrs. Ellison, my name is David Carr. This is my associate, Michael Lee. We've been working with your late husband on his estate planning." I narrowed my eyes. "That's impossible. Edward never mentioned either of you. Our legal affairs have always been handled by Ms. Harper." Gregory shifted, looking briefly at the floor before speaking again. "Dad made some changes, Mom. 6 months ago. He decided it made the most sense for all major assets, the house, the savings accounts, the investments to be transferred to me. That way I can make sure you're cared for." The words hit me like a physical blow. For a second, the lobby seemed to tilt, and I had to steady myself with a hand on the back of a nearby chair. "Cared for," I repeated, the words tasting bitter. "I've been caring for myself just fine for 66 years. Gregory's expression didn't change, but Vanessa leaned in slightly, her perfume a soft but intrusive cloud. "We've already been thinking ahead," she said smoothly. "There's a beautiful luxury retirement residence about 30 minutes from here. Very safe, lots of amenities, activities with people your age. You'd have your own apartment, and we could visit whenever we want." I stared at her, and in that moment, I saw exactly what this was. Not an act of care, but an eviction wrapped in a smile. The home Edward and I built together, the one where we planted every tree in the yard, chose every piece of furniture, lived every memory for 43 years, reduced to an asset to be transferred on paper. "This isn't the time," I said quietly, but firmly. "Your father was buried less than 2 hours ago." Gregory's jaw tightened. "That's exactly why it's the time. The sooner we handle this, the sooner we can all move forward." Move forward. As if Edward's death were an inconvenience on their calendar, something to check off before the next social engagement. I looked into my son's eyes and searched for the boy who used to run to me when he was scared of thunderstorms, who used to leave crayon drawings on my nightstand. All I saw was distance. And in Vanessa's eyes, cool, blue, unflinching, I saw ambition, the kind that didn't stop at the grave. I didn't yet know exactly what they were playing at, but I knew one thing with perfect clarity. Edward would never have set this in motion willingly. And if they thought they could corner me in my grief, they were about to learn they'd underestimated both of us. David Carr adjusted his tie, the subtle movement betraying his impatience. "Mrs. Ellison," he began, voice smooth but firm, "we understand this is an emotional time. That's why it's important to finalize these documents today, before the estate is tied up in unnecessary legal complications." Michael Lee nodded beside him, holding out a sleek leather folder as if I should take it without question. Vanessa's hand was still looped through Gregory's arm, her smile perfectly measured. "We can spare you the stress of court filings and all the back and forth. It's a straightforward process." My eyes stayed on the folder, but I didn't reach for it. "I'll need to review anything with Cynthia Harper," I said, each word deliberate. "She's handled every legal matter for this family since before you came along." Vanessa's smile didn't falter, but the sweetness in it curdled. "Margaret, that's not really necessary. These gentlemen are professionals, and they're here now. Why prolong things?" Gregory stepped forward slightly, and his voice took on the tone I'd heard too many times in the past decade, the one he used when explaining to me why my opinions were outdated or my worries unfounded. "Mom, let's be practical. You don't need to be bogged down in details. You're 66. What do you need all that money for? It makes more sense for me to manage things. You can focus on enjoying your life without worrying about bills or maintenance or investments." His words were meant to sound like reassurance, but every syllable felt like a shove toward the door of my own life. My fingers tightened on the tissue in my hand, then loosened. I took a slow breath and reached for my purse, the same black leather one Edward had given me for Christmas last year. The weight of it on my arm felt heavier now, as though it knew what I was about to pull from it. I didn't rush. I let them watch as I unlatched the clasp and slipped my hand inside, fingertips brushing against the smooth surface of the cream-colored envelope. It was thick, the paper substantial, and on the front, in Edward's unmistakable handwriting, were the words, "For Margaret, when the vultures circle." I looked up at Gregory, then at Vanessa, and finally at the two lawyers. "Edward gave this to me 2 weeks before he died," I said softly. "He was very clear about when I should open it." I broke the seal and unfolded the single sheet inside. Edward's handwriting filled the page in deliberate strokes, and I began to read aloud, my voice steadier than I expected. "If my wife is being pressured to sign away her rights to our shared assets, know this: any documents presented under such circumstances are fraudulent. I have made no such changes to my will and have not engaged any legal representation outside of Cynthia Harper." I glanced up in time to see Michael Lee's hand twitch slightly on the folder he was holding. Vanessa's grip on Gregory's arm tightened just enough for me to notice. I continued, "For the past year, I have been fully aware of certain intentions regarding my estate. I have taken steps to ensure that Margaret will not be left vulnerable or dependent on those who see her as an inconvenience. To this end, I engaged the services of Paul Denton, retired detective and trusted friend, but to document the actions and statements of certain parties." The words echoed in the quiet of the lobby, and I could almost feel Edward standing beside me. David Carr's jaw had tightened, and Michael Lee's eyes flickered toward the exit, just for a second. Gregory's expression was a mix of confusion and something else, worry, perhaps, but it was Vanessa's face that told me everything. The flawless composure she wore like armor had developed its first hairline crack. Her lips pressed together, and her gaze darted toward the lawyers, a silent conversation passing between them that I wasn't meant to see. "What is this supposed to mean?" she asked finally, her tone clipped now, the warmth stripped away. "It means," I said, folding the letter carefully and sliding it back into the envelope, "that Edward saw this coming, and he prepared for it." I let my eyes linger on hers, making sure she understood I wasn't speaking in riddles. "Paul Denton has been keeping track of things, dates, conversations, places you've been, all of it documented." "Mom," Gregory started, but I raised a hand. "Not now, Gregory. You've brought strangers to your father's funeral to try and take away the life we built together." "I'll speak when I'm ready, and not a moment before." David Carr cleared his throat, but the confidence from earlier was gone. "Mrs. Ellison, I'm sure there's been some misunderstanding." "There's no misunderstanding," I interrupted. "You can tell whoever sent you that nothing is being signed today. Or ever." The two lawyers exchanged uneasy glances, and I could see them recalculating. Vanessa's eyes had gone cold, a shade of steel I'd seen only once before years ago, when she thought no one was watching. I held the envelope against my chest, the weight of it both a comfort and a warning. They'd expected me to fold, to sign without question. Instead, Edward's words had turned the air sharp, and I could feel the balance in the room shift. Whatever game they were playing, I had just reminded them I still had pieces on the board. David Carr's mouth opened like he was about to say something, but nothing came out. He glanced at Michael Lee, who looked just as pale. Without another word, They both reached into their jacket pockets, each producing a small rectangle of cardstock. They placed them on the nearest table. The gesture hurried, almost perfunctory, as if they wanted to leave proof they'd been here but not enough to invite scrutiny. I picked one up. The edges were uneven, the ink smudged in places, and the paper so thin it nearly bent under my fingers. No embossed lettering, no proper firm address, no sign of the expensive quality you'd expect from a legitimate legal office. My stomach turned not from surprise, but from the confirmation of what I'd suspected since the moment they appeared. These men weren't Edward's lawyers. They weren't anyone's lawyers. This had been a performance from the start. I set the card down carefully, watching them retreat toward the door without meeting my eyes. Michael was already avoiding Vanessa's gaze. David's pace quickened as they crossed the lobby, his hand tightening around the folder he hadn't managed to hand me. I didn't stop them. There would be time for that later, when I had more than Edward's letter to stand on. For now, I let them walk away, because their leaving told me something important. They'd expected this to be easy. They'd expected me to be too stunned by grief to think clearly. And in that, they'd been very, very wrong. I turned back to Gregory just in time to see the color drain completely from his face. His mouth opened like he meant to speak, but instead, his knees buckled. I reached forward instinctively, but he was already going down. The sound of his body hitting the polished tile floor was sharp enough to make several people turn their heads. "Greg!" Vanessa's voice was high, almost shrill. She crouched beside him, one hand on his shoulder, the other fumbling for his wrist as though she meant to check his pulse. But her movements didn't match her expression. She looked unsettled, yes, but it wasn't worry for Gregory that I saw flicker there. It was something sharper, more calculating. Like a chess player realizing the game had shifted and trying to see 3 moves ahead. "Someone get some water," she called over her shoulder, though she didn't bother to look and see if anyone was moving. A man I vaguely recognized from Edward's church stepped forward with a bottle from his coat pocket. Vanessa took it with a tight smile, twisting off the cap but not helping Gregory drink. Instead, she hovered, her eyes darting between me and the doorway where the so-called lawyers had disappeared. Gregory groaned faintly and shifted, his hand going to his temple. "What happened?" His voice was thick, sluggish, and for a moment, I thought he might have truly hit his head when he fell. Vanessa leaned closer, her words low but still carrying across the suddenly hushed room. "You fainted, probably from all the stress. We should get you home." The suggestion was quick, maybe too quick. I stayed where I was, my purse still hanging from my arm, the cream envelope safely tucked inside again. "We'll make sure he's all right," I said, but I didn't step closer. Not yet. I was watching Vanessa. Her fingers tightened on Gregory's arm, steadying him as he pushed himself upright, but her gaze slid back to me, and what I saw there wasn't the polite concern she might have worn for an audience. It was irritation. And underneath that, the faintest trace of something that looked a lot like fear. Gregory let Vanessa help him to a nearby chair, his breathing evening out slowly. I noticed he still wouldn't quite meet my eyes. Whether that was guilt or confusion, I couldn't tell yet. "You should rest," Vanessa murmured, smoothing his sleeve with a gesture that was just a touch too performative. She glanced at the discarded business cards on the table, and her mouth pressed into a thin line. "This isn't over," she said softly, but whether she meant it for Gregory or for me, I couldn't be certain. I gave her a small, steady nod. "No," I agreed. "It's not." Around us, the murmurs had started again, people pretending to return to their conversations while their eyes lingered on the little tableau. We made the son pale and shaken in his chair, the daughter-in-law poised but tense, the widow standing with her purse in hand, refusing to look like a woman cornered. My legs were heavy, but I made myself stand a little taller, my spine straight, my chin level. If they wanted a picture of me to carry into whatever came next, I'd make sure it was one of strength. Vanessa finally looked away first, focusing on adjusting Gregory's tie even though it didn't need adjusting. He muttered something to her too low for me to hear, and she nodded quickly, her expression smoothing back into something more neutral. But I saw the edge still there in her posture. She was already thinking of her next move, and that told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't just an ugly moment at a funeral. This was a line being drawn. I took one last glance at the cheap curling edge of the business card on the table. Then I turned and walked toward the reception hall without looking back. The day had already taken Edward from me. I wouldn't let it take my resolve. In my gut, I knew this was only the opening act. The next morning, I woke with the kind of heaviness that comes from more than just grief. The sunlight creeping through the curtains felt too bright, almost intrusive, as if the world was impatient for me to get on with things. My coffee sat cooling on the table while I stared at the phone, my finger hovering over Cynthia Harper's number. Cynthia had been Edward's and my attorney for decades, sharp as a tack, no nonsense, and fiercely loyal. If anyone could cut through the mess of yesterday, it was her. I pressed the call button before I could talk myself out of it. She answered on the second ring, her voice as steady and warm as ever. "Margaret, I'm so sorry for your loss. How are you holding up?" I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. "I've been better. Cynthia, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Did Edward make any changes to his will in the last 6 months?" There was a pause long enough for me to feel my stomach tighten, but then she spoke, crisp and certain. "Absolutely not. I reviewed his will with him less than a year ago, and we discussed his wishes in detail. You retained full ownership of all marital assets, your home, bank accounts, investments, everything. Gregory is a beneficiary, yes, but only after your passing, and even then, under specific conditions your husband insisted on." I straightened in my chair. "Conditions?" "Yes," Cynthia said, her tone firm but careful. Edward was clear that Gregory's inheritance would depend on him meeting certain behavioral requirements. He didn't want to see his legacy squandered or mismanaged. If Gregory failed to meet those conditions, his share would be redirected elsewhere. My mind flickered back to the cheap business cards, the fake lawyers, the way Gregory had parroted Vanessa's lines about me not needing all that money. Edward had seen this coming. "Cynthia," I said slowly, "you should know that Gregory and Vanessa showed up at the funeral with 2 men claiming to be Edward's attorneys. They tried to get me to sign papers transferring everything to Gregory immediately." I heard Cynthia's sharp inhale. That is exactly the sort of scenario Edward anticipated. He told me more than once he was concerned about fraudulent attempts after his death. "Margaret, you are not to sign anything without me present ever, and keep any communication from them documented." "I have Edward's letter," I told her, my voice steadying as I said it. "He spelled out that any documents brought to me under pressure were fraudulent. He even mentioned hiring Paul Denton." "Good," Cynthia said. "That letter could be crucial. Edward was meticulous. It will hold weight." After we hung up, I felt a strange combination of relief and dread. Relief that Edward had safeguarded me. Dread because I knew this wasn't over. They'd try again, and next time, they might be smarter about it. I didn't have to wait long to test my theory. Gregory called that afternoon, his voice a mix of forced casualness and underlying tension. "Mom, Vanessa and I thought we should come by to clear the air." I almost laughed. Clear the air. That was one way to put it, I agreed, because part of me wanted him to hear the truth straight from my mouth. When they arrived, Gregory was dressed neatly but looked tired, like he hadn't slept well. Vanessa, of course, was flawless, hair smooth, makeup understated but perfect, her expression friendly enough for a photograph. We sat in the living room, sunlight spilling through the lace curtains. Gregory started talking about how they'd been concerned for me, how it would be simpler if he managed things. I let him go on just long enough for Vanessa to relax into her chair, her guard slipping just slightly. Then I leaned forward, folding my hands in my lap. "Gregory, I spoke with Cynthia Harper this morning. Edward's will hasn't changed. I retain everything. You inherit only after I pass, and only if you meet the conditions your father outlined." Gregory blinked, his mouth opening like he wanted to argue but didn't know where to start. Vanessa's smile froze in place. "Conditions?" she asked lightly, but her eyes sharpened. "Yes," I said, meeting her gaze. "Your father anticipated certain influences in Gregory's life might not have his best interests at heart. He wanted to protect him and me from that." Vanessa's fingers tightened on the armrest, but she kept her voice even. "That seems excessive, does it?" I tilted my head. "Because it sounds to me like Edward knew exactly what could happen." I let my eyes flick between the two of them before settling on Gregory. "Speaking of knowing what could happen, Vanessa, how was lunch with Christopher Mallory last Thursday? Did you enjoy the wine at Le Jardin?" The change in the room was immediate. Gregory's head snapped toward her. Confusion etched on his face. Vanessa's color drained, just slightly, before she forced a laugh. I don't know what you're talking about. You will, I said quietly. Sooner than you think. Gregory looked between us, his brow furrowing, and I knew the seed of doubt had been planted. Edward had given me more than legal protection. He'd given me the tools to dismantle this game, piece by piece, and I was just getting started. It was late afternoon when I heard the knock at the door, 3 short raps. Hesitant, almost as if the person on the other side wasn't sure they wanted to be there. I wiped my hands on a dish towel and opened it to find Gregory standing on the porch. He looked nothing like the polished man who had stood beside Vanessa at the funeral. His hair was uncombed, his shirt wrinkled, and there were shadows under his eyes that spoke of a sleepless night. He didn't meet my gaze right away. "Mom," he said, his voice low, rougher than usual. "Can I come in?" I stepped aside without a word, watching him cross the threshold like a man carrying too much weight on his shoulders. He went straight to the living room and sat on the edge of the couch, elbows on his knees, staring at the floor. I stayed standing for a moment, letting the silence stretch. Finally, he looked up at me, and in his eyes I saw something I hadn't seen in years: uncertainty. "What you said yesterday," he began, "about Vanessa, is it true?" I didn't answer right away. Instead, I walked to Edward's old desk in the corner, the one with the drawer that stuck just a little if you didn't pull it the right way. I opened it and took out a manila folder, thick with papers and photographs. I carried it to the coffee table and set it down in front of him. "I don't say things like that unless I have proof," I said quietly. He hesitated before reaching for it, his fingers brushing the worn edges of the folder like it might burn him. I sat down across from him as he opened it. The first page was a photograph, Vanessa, in a fitted navy dress, sitting at an outdoor cafe table across from Christopher Mallory. His hand was resting over hers, their faces close, smiling in a way that was far too intimate to be innocent. Gregory's brows knit together, and he flipped to the next page. Another photo, this one of the two of them leaving the same cafe, walking side by side, her arm linked through his. The timestamp in the corner read, Thursday, 1:17 p.m. I watched his face as he turned to the next section. Credit card statements showing charges at restaurants, hotels, and boutiques in Christopher's city, on days when Vanessa had told Gregory she was visiting her sister. There were hotel records, too, printed on official letterhead, with both their names listed as guests. This could be... He stopped, the words dying in his throat as he looked at the dates again. "No," I said gently but firmly. "It couldn't be a coincidence. Paul Denton documented every instance, every excuse she gave you. This isn't one misunderstanding, it's a pattern." Gregory leaned back, the folder still open on his lap. His hands were shaking, and his breathing had gone shallow. "How long have you known?" "I suspected for a while," I admitted. "Edward found out for certain about 2 weeks before he died. He wanted to protect you, but he also knew you wouldn't believe him without proof. So he made sure I had everything, in case the time came." Gregory's eyes dropped back to the photograph on top. He stared at it for a long moment before closing the folder slowly, like shutting a door he wasn't ready to look through again. "I defended her," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Every time you or Dad hinted that something was wrong, I told myself you were being unfair. I told her you were just jealous of our marriage. You chose the woman you thought she was," I said softly. "Not the woman she really is." He covered his face with his hands, his shoulders bowing inwards. The quiet devastation in his posture was more painful to watch than any angry outburst could have been. I wanted to reach out to him, to bridge the distance that had grown between us over the years, but I knew this was a moment he had to process on his own. After a long stretch of silence, he lowered his hands and looked at me, his expression raw. "What do I do now?" "First, you accept the truth," I said. "Then you decide what kind of man you want to be from here on out. She's been shaping your decisions for years, Gregory. It's time you took that back." He nodded slowly, as if the idea was heavy but settling into place. "I don't even know who I am without her," he admitted. "Then maybe it's time to find out," I replied. He sat there for a while longer, the folder untouched beside him, his gaze fixed on nothing in particular. When he finally stood, he didn't say goodbye, just a quiet, "Thanks, Mom," before walking to the door. I watched him go, the weight of Edward's absence pressing against me again. But for the first time in a long while, I thought maybe, just maybe, I'd get my son back. The call came the next morning, just as I was rinsing the breakfast dishes. Vanessa's voice floated through the receiver, light and syrupy, as if yesterday had never happened. Margaret, she began, I think we got off on the wrong foot at the funeral. Emotions were high, and none of us were at our best. I'd like to speak with you privately. Woman to woman, I didn't answer right away. I could almost hear her smile through the phone, the kind she wore when she thought she was steering the conversation. What would we be talking about? I asked. About what's best for Gregory. And for the children, of course. I think you and I might have more common ground than you realize. Her tone was coaxing, the edges smoothed to perfection. How about lunch? That little cafe on Main Street, you know, the one with the patio? 1 o'clock? I agreed. Not because I believed her, but because I wanted to see what she'd try when she thought she had me alone. The cafe was half full when I arrived, the clink of silverware and the hum of conversation blending into a soft background noise. Vanessa was already there, seated at a table near the window where sunlight pooled across the polished wood. She'd dressed with calculated restraint, soft cream blouse, pale blue scarf, minimal makeup, her hair pulled into a loose twist that gave the impression of effortless grace. It was the kind of look designed to disarm. Margaret, she greeted warmly, standing just enough to lean across the table and air-kiss the space beside my cheek. I took the liberty of ordering for you. Cappuccino, right? Your favorite. She motioned to the steaming cup in front of my seat. I looked at it, then at her, and said nothing as I sat down. I drink black coffee. Always have. She knew that. Ordering the wrong drink wasn't a mistake. It was a small, quiet way of reminding me she thought she could dictate the terms. I wanted to start by saying I'm sorry, she continued, wrapping her hands around her own mug like she needed the warmth. Yesterday was not my finest moment. I let my grief and worry for Gregory and the kids get the better of me. I lifted the cup, took a slow sip despite the milk I didn't want, and set it down. Is that so? Her eyes softened, or at least she was skilled enough to make them appear that way. I think we both want the same thing, Gregory's happiness and the children's stability. And I think we can work together to make that happen. There's no reason for tension between us. I leaned back in my chair, folding my hands in my lap. And what exactly would working together look like to you? She tilted her head, letting out a soft, practiced laugh. It means understanding that we're on the same side. You're his mother. I'm his wife. If we present a united front, we can protect him from unnecessary stress. The way she said, unnecessary stress, made it sound like a code phrase. I wondered if she thought I'd hand over Edward's letter and the evidence Paul Denton had gathered in exchange for some illusion of peace. You seem very invested in avoiding stress for Gregory, I said. Yet somehow, you brought 2 fake lawyers to his father's funeral. Her fingers tightened on her mug, but her smile didn't falter. That was a misunderstanding. I thought it would be easier for everyone if things were handled quickly. I see now that was premature. She sighed, lowering her gaze for a beat before looking back at me with an expression that might have passed for sincerity to someone who didn't know her. Margaret, I love your son. I want what's best for him, and for Emma and Lucas. I think we can both agree they deserve stability. You've been through enough, you shouldn't have to deal with courtrooms and legal battles. And what would you suggest I do instead? I asked evenly. She smiled again, as if I'd opened a door. Trust me to handle things. Let me make life easier for you. You've earned your rest. You shouldn't be worrying about property, accounts, or unpleasant rumors. There it was. A veiled warning, wrapped in concern. I met her gaze, holding it just long enough for the air between us to shift. You're right about one thing, I said finally. I have been through enough, which is why I'm not in the mood for games. The smile in her eyes dimmed, but she still nodded as though we'd reached some kind of agreement. I let her believe it for now. This meeting had told me more than she realized, and it had confirmed something Edward had known long before I did. Vanessa's charm was just another weapon. She didn't bother with small talk after the plates were cleared. The shift in her posture was subtle but unmistakable, shoulders back, chin lifted, eyes fixed on mine with a brightness that was no longer meant to charm. From her purse, she withdrew a plain white envelope and set it on the table between us. There's $50,000 in there, she said, her voice low but steady. Cashier's check. No questions asked. You walk away with that, and we never have to talk about Edward's little stash again. I stared at the envelope without touching it. Stash? I repeated. The papers, the photographs. Whatever that private investigator found. I don't care how you got them. I don't care where they are now, I just want them gone. She smiled faintly, as though she were doing me a favor. It's enough to make you comfortable for quite a while. I let a pause hang between us, just long enough for her to believe I was considering it. Then I reached for the envelope, not to take it, but to tear it cleanly in half, the ripping sound loud enough to turn a few heads nearby. The two pieces fluttered to the table like fallen leaves. Her mouth tightened. That was unwise. I don't take bribes, Vanessa. She leaned in then, the softness gone entirely. Maybe you don't take bribes, Margaret, but you do care about family. And you wouldn't want Gregory and the children hearing what he's said about you. Because I have it all on tape. Hours of him complaining about you, calling you controlling, saying you were cold to him as a child, saying you favored work over family. Little things, but enough to shift their opinion. I could feel the heat of her words pressing into me, trying to find a crack. You think I'd be rattled by that? I asked. I think you care what your son thinks, and I know you care about Emma and Lucas. Imagine your granddaughter asking why her daddy says you never loved him. Imagine her repeating those words to her friends. That's the kind of damage you can't undo. I took a slow breath, my fingers resting lightly on the edge of the table. If Gregory said those things, then they're his feelings to own. But I also know manipulation when I hear it. And you're desperate enough to use anything, aren't you? Her jaw worked, but she kept her eyes locked on mine. You're not untouchable, Margaret. I could make things very uncomfortable for you. I stood then, smoothing the front of my jacket. My voice was calm, even measured, but it carried the weight of finality. Vanessa, Edward knew exactly the kind of games you'd play. He planned for them. So no, I'm not worried about your recordings. And I'm not going to destroy anything. Not now, not ever. Her expression shifted just a flicker of doubt, quickly buried under that carefully maintained mask. But it was enough for me to see I'd landed somewhere she didn't want me to. I pushed my chair back, the legs scraping against the floor, and gathered my purse. You've made yourself very clear. And so have I. This conversation is over. Margaret! I didn't look back as I walked toward the door, my heels clicking against the tile. The air outside was brisk, cool enough to sting my cheeks. I drew it in deep, letting it push out the last of her voice from my mind. She thought she could buy my silence, then bully it out of me when money failed. But Edward's words in that cream envelope still echoed in my head. If they try to force your hand, it's because they know they've already lost. And in that moment, I knew exactly how right he'd been. This wasn't over, not by a long stretch. But unlike Vanessa, I didn't need to bluff or threaten. My hand was already stronger than hers. All I had to do was play it at the right time. I didn't open it right away. The thick cream envelope had been sitting in my desk drawer for weeks. The words "only if necessary" written in Edward's neat, slanted handwriting across the front. He'd sealed it with a firmness that told me he'd known, even then, that one day I would have to face its contents. That day had arrived. The rain was tapping a steady rhythm against the window as I sat at the kitchen table, the envelope in front of me like a silent dare. I slipped my finger beneath the flap and tore it open. Inside, a stack of papers and a folded letter, Edward's voice reaching out from beyond the grave. My Margaret, it began. If you are reading this, then you've been put in a position I prayed you wouldn't have to endure. But I know you, and I know you wouldn't open this unless you truly needed what's inside. I could see him in my mind as I read, calm, deliberate, his eyes heavy with the weight of unspoken truths. You may recall the day you stayed home from my chemo appointment last winter. You said you weren't feeling well. I told you it was fine, but later, while waiting for the nurse, I overheard Gregory on the phone. He was apologizing to Vanessa for having to go with me instead of meeting her at lunch. She told him I wouldn't miss him if he didn't come. She told him to let the old man handle it alone. My hands tightened around the pages. It wasn't the words alone, Margaret, it was the tone. She has a way of slipping poison into people slowly. I heard our son say, "You know I'm on your side." And I knew then she had been working on him for years, turning him against not just me, but you as well. The letters shifted from personal to precise, Edward's meticulous way of laying out facts when emotion wasn't enough. The documents enclosed are the result of 6 months of private investigation. Vanessa has embezzled over $200,000 from Gregory's business in the past 4 years. She used his signature without his knowledge on at least 9 transactions, then routed the money into accounts in her name. I have bank statements, transaction logs, and 2 notarized affidavits from the accountant she tried to pay off. The next page was a bank ledger highlighted transfers, suspicious withdrawals, and a signature that wasn't Gregory's. Her pattern isn't new, Edward's letter continued. 10 years ago, she partnered with a man named Thomas Avery in a boutique travel agency. Within 18 months, Thomas filed for bankruptcy. Vanessa had drained their joint account and moved on. 3 years later, she was engaged to a property developer named Howard Linton. He died in what police called an accidental fall down a flight of stairs. The coroner's report left unresolved injuries on his wrists. She inherited nearly $500,000 from him. My breath caught. I'd known she was manipulative, but this was predatory. Paul Denton has also obtained proof that she is now involved with Christopher Mallory, the same man you've heard me mention in passing. Together, they have been making plans to leave the country. The most disturbing part is that her emails to him suggest she intends to take Emma and Lucas with her, using Gregory's emotional instability as justification for sole custody. Christopher has a passport in his desk with her maiden name on it, issued just 6 weeks ago. I felt the air leave my lungs. Images of my grandchildren, bright-eyed, full of laughter, flashed before me, only to be replaced by the thought of them whisked away, their lives rewritten by lies. The last lines of Edward's letter were underlined twice. If you must use this, use it decisively. Do not warn her. Do not give her the chance to run. Everything in this envelope is admissible in court. I trust you to protect what matters. I trust you to protect yourself. I set the letter down slowly, my fingers brushing over the edges of the documents beneath it. There were photographs, email printouts, even a copy of that fraudulent passport. Edward had anticipated every possibility, prepared every weapon I might need. For a moment, I just sat there, letting the truth settle in. This wasn't simply about money anymore. This was about safety, about family, about making sure Vanessa's reach ended before she destroyed anyone else. I closed the envelope, but this time, I didn't return it to the drawer. I placed it in my handbag. Edward's voice, steady and sure, seemed to linger in the air. It was necessary now, and I was ready. The phone rang just after dawn, slicing through the quiet of my kitchen. I'd been standing at the counter, pouring my second cup of coffee, the steam curling into the dim morning light. I glanced at the screen, Cynthia Harper. My pulse quickened. Cynthia didn't call this early unless something was wrong. "Margaret," she said, no pleasantries, her voice sharp and urgent. "We have a situation." Vanessa attempted a $50,000 withdrawal from one of Gregory's business accounts, an account she forged into your name to try to disguise it. The bank's fraud team flagged it and called me immediately. I set the mug down, my hand trembling slightly. "Where is she now?" "That's the thing," Cynthia continued. "The withdrawal was denied, but the activity triggered a federal alert. The bank called the FBI. They traced her card activity. She's at Dallas-Fort Worth Airport. And Margaret," she hesitated, "she has the children with her. Both of them." I closed my eyes for a brief, steadying breath. Edward's words from the envelope rang in my head. Do not warn her. Do not give her the chance to run. This was the moment he had prepared me for, and it was happening faster than I could have imagined. They think she's attempting to leave the country. She's holding 2 passports for the children and one for herself under her maiden name, Cynthia said, her voice low, as if speaking too loudly might tip the balance. "All 3 are fake. FBI field agents are already in place at the airport." I pressed the phone tighter to my ear, my voice calm but steel-edged. "Do they have the gate?" "Yes. Flight to Cancun. Scheduled departure in 40 minutes. The room seemed to sharpen into focus. I could picture Vanessa dressed in her calculated softness, perhaps a scarf draped loosely over her hair, the children's hands clasped in hers, their faces confused but obedient. She would be spinning them some story about a surprise vacation, about how their father was going to meet them there. The thought made my stomach turn. Cynthia spoke again. "The agents are moving in now. I'll update you the moment I hear anything." The next 10 minutes stretched into an eternity. I walked the length of the kitchen and back, my fingertips grazing the edge of the counter, my mind replaying every smile Vanessa had ever given me that I now knew was laced with calculation. The children's laughter, their small hands in mine, those were the stakes now, far beyond property or inheritance. The phone rang again. I answered on the first ring. "It's over," Cynthia said, a note of relief breaking through her professional tone. The FBI intercepted her at the gate. She tried to claim she was taking the children on a last-minute trip for school break, but the agents had the forged passports in hand. They didn't even let her reach the jet bridge. I exhaled slowly, the knot in my chest loosening just enough to breathe. And the children? They're safe. Protective custody for now. Standard procedure until the courts sort guardianship. Gregory's already been contacted. Well, let's just say he's shattered. But Margaret Vanessa's not going anywhere. The FBI has her on multiple charges: fraud, forgery, attempted international kidnapping. A strange calm settled over me. Not triumph, this wasn't victory in the gloating sense. It was something heavier, steadier. The knowledge that the danger Edward had warned me about was contained, at least for now. I thanked Cynthia and ended the call, then sat at the kitchen table with my cooling coffee. The rain had stopped outside, leaving the world washed clean. I thought of Edward again, not as the man in the hospital bed, but as the man who had seen through Vanessa long before I had, who had left me with every tool I needed to protect what mattered. The headlines would come soon enough. Vanessa had always loved attention, but this time, the glare of the spotlight would be her undoing. And as for Gregory, I knew the reckoning between us was still ahead. But for now, I allowed myself the quiet certainty that the children were safe, that the worst of her reach had been severed. The game she had been playing for years ended not with my defeat, but with her in handcuffs at an airport gate, and I intended to make sure she never got another turn. Gregory showed up at my door 2 days after Vanessa's arrest, looking like a man who had crawled out of a storm. His suit jacket was wrinkled, shirt untucked. The once proud sharpness in his shoulders now slumped under a weight I couldn't measure. When I opened the door, his eyes red-rimmed and exhausted met mine with something I hadn't seen in years: humility. "Mom," he said, voice low. "Can I come in?" I stepped aside without a word. He moved past me, not like a son returning home, but like a penitent man approaching an altar he'd abandoned. He didn't sit right away, just stood in the middle of the living room, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "I had no idea," he began, but the words faltered. His throat tightened, and he tried again. "I mean, I knew Vanessa could be manipulative, controlling even, but this, the FBI, the passports," his voice broke. "She was going to take them from me, from us. I could have lost them forever." I watched him for a moment before reaching for the envelope I'd kept on the mantel since the day I opened Edward's last package. This one wasn't labeled for me. It had Gregory's name, written in Edward's steady hand, and sealed in the kind of way that made you understand it wasn't to be opened until it mattered. And now, it mattered. "This is from your father," I said, holding it out. "He wanted you to have it when you were ready to see the truth." Gregory hesitated before taking it. He sat at the coffee table, carefully breaking the seal, unfolding the thick paper. I stayed silent, letting Edward's voice do the work I couldn't. "Gregory," the letter began, "if you're reading this, it means your mother decided the time was right. I wish I could have told you this in person, but by the time you needed to hear it, I knew I wouldn't be here. Son, you've been living under the illusion that love means defending someone no matter what, but there is a difference between loyalty and blindness." Gregory's brow furrowed as he read on, his lips tightening. "I overheard more than you ever knew. Vanessa mocking you to her friends, laughing about how easy it was to turn you against us. I heard her tell Christopher Mallory, yes, the man she's been seeing, that she was only staying long enough to drain the accounts and get full custody of the children before leaving the country. She planned it for over a year." I slid my phone across the table. "Play the first file." Gregory tapped the screen. Vanessa's voice filled the room, clear and sharp. "Gregory will believe anything I tell him. He's too afraid to question me. By the time he realizes, we'll be in Mexico, and he'll never see the kids again." Gregory flinched at the sound, his hand covering his mouth. I could see the devastation in his eyes, but also something else, a dawning realization that the life he thought he was defending had been a trap. He played the next recording. This time, Vanessa was laughing, her voice dripping with derision. "Honestly, Greg's good for one thing, signing whatever I put in front of him. Everything else, Christopher's better at." He stopped the playback and set the phone down with trembling hands. Edward's letter continued. "I can't undo the years she's taken from you, but I can give you the means to start again. There is an account in your name with $100,000. Use it to rebuild your business, to provide for your children, and to free yourself from anyone who uses your love as a weapon. They need a father who can see clearly. Be that man. Gregory folded the letter slowly, as though it might break if handled too fast. When he finally looked up, his eyes were wet. I don't deserve this, he said. Not from him. Not from you. Deserving isn't the point, I told him. The children deserve a father who will fight for them, not someone else's puppet. If you want redemption, Gregory, start there. He nodded, swallowing hard. I will. I swear it. For the first time in years, I believed him. Not because he said the words, but because the man in front of me no longer carried the brittle arrogance Vanessa had cultivated. He looked stripped bare, humbled, but standing in the ruins of his choices, with the will to build something better. As he left that afternoon, he paused at the door. Thank you for not giving up on me, he said quietly. I didn't answer right away. I simply met his gaze, the same steel in my voice that Edward used to have when something mattered. Make sure the children never have to thank you for the same thing. He nodded once, and for the first time in a long while, I saw my son not the man Vanessa had shaped him into, but the man Edward and I had raised walking back into the world with purpose. 6 months can feel like a lifetime when you've been living in survival mode. Yet here I was, sitting on the porch with a cup of chamomile tea, watching my grandchildren chase fireflies across the yard. Their laughter was lighter now, freer, as though the shadows that had clung to them for years had finally lifted. I breathed it in like oxygen. Gregory had kept his word. He'd poured himself into building something not just for himself, but for them. Ellison, Sons Construction, named in honor of Edward, had opened its doors 3 months ago. With a modest but respectable office on the corner of Main and Willow, the name was carved into a brass plate by the entrance, the letters catching the sunlight in a way that made my heart ache with pride. At first, I'd wondered if Gregory would have the stamina to see it through. Starting a business from scratch is never easy, and he was rebuilding not only his professional life but his sense of self. But I underestimated him. Every morning, he was up before dawn, his truck loaded with tools and blueprints, visiting job sites, meeting clients, and earning back the reputation Vanessa had chipped away. People in town noticed the change. His handshake was firmer, his gaze steady, his voice free from the defensive edge it once carried. The children, meanwhile, had flourished under my care. My home had become their safe harbor. Homework at the kitchen table, pancake breakfasts on Saturdays, bedtime stories in the big armchair Edward used to claim as his reading spot. They were sleeping through the night again, smiling without hesitation, and their teachers told me they seemed more focused, more secure. I knew they still missed their father during the weekdays, but Gregory made sure to be there every evening, often bringing them to watch him work on small projects, so they could see what honest effort looked like. And then there was Vanessa. The trial had been swift, almost unnervingly so. Once the FBI had their case, the evidence was irrefutable. Forged passports, financial statements showing the 200 she'd siphoned from Gregory's business, testimony from Christopher Mallory himself in exchange for a reduced sentence. She faced charges of wire fraud, bank fraud, embezzlement, identity theft, and attempted international parental kidnapping. Her lawyer tried to paint her as a victim of circumstance, a woman desperate to protect her children from an oppressive in-law. But the jury didn't buy it, not after hearing the recordings of her mocking Gregory, not after past victims came forward to tell their stories. One man, a small business owner from Houston, described how Vanessa had drained his accounts before vanishing, leaving him bankrupt. Another, a woman in her 50s, spoke about her brother, Vanessa's former fiancé, whose sudden death had been labeled accidental, though the circumstances were suspicious enough to draw sharp intakes of breath in the courtroom. Each story added weight to the truth. Vanessa had been playing this game for years, moving from one victim to the next. When the verdict came guilty on all counts, Gregory sat beside me, his shoulders finally relaxing. The sentence was long enough that she wouldn't see the outside of a prison for decades. I didn't feel joy. Exactly. Justice is heavier than that. But I did feel a deep, anchoring sense of safety, knowing the children were beyond her reach. Life didn't suddenly turn perfect after that. There were still days when Gregory seemed haunted, moments when the children asked questions I didn't have easy answers for. But there was a forward motion now. No more treading water. No more pretending not to see the cracks. One evening, Gregory came over after work, dirt still on his boots, a rolled-up set of blueprints under his arm. We just signed our first major contract, he told me, his smile breaking wide. A community center. I'm dedicating it to Dad. There'll be a plaque with his name. I swallowed hard, nodding. Edward would have been proud of the business, proud of the man his son had become, proud of the resilience we'd all found in the rubble Vanessa left behind. That night, as I tucked the children into bed, the youngest whispered, "Grandma, are we safe now?" "Yes," I said, smoothing her hair. "We're safe. And we're home." The fireflies still danced outside, and for the first time in a long while, I believed the darkness had no hold here anymore. I was peeling apples for a pie when the phone rang. The sharp, business-like tone of the ring told me it was the landline, which I still kept for official calls. I wiped my hands on a towel and picked it up. "Margaret, it's Cynthia." Her voice carried that mix of satisfaction and gravity I'd learned to recognize she never called unless there was something worth hearing. "We've just wrapped the asset recovery process from Vanessa's accounts." I sat down at the kitchen table, my fingers curling around the receiver. "Go on." She didn't waste time. $400,000. That's what we've been able to confirm, liquidate, and secure. It was tucked away in 2 offshore accounts, plus a small portfolio under one of her aliases. The court has finalized restitution distribution. I let out a low whistle. I'd known Vanessa had been hiding money, but the number still surprised me. And the breakdown? Cynthia read it out like she was reciting scripture. 50% to Gregory, 25% in a trust for the children locked until they're 21, and 25% to you. I blinked. "To me?" "Yes," she said firmly. "Per Edward's contingency clauses. He was specific, if restitution was recovered, you were to receive a quarter outright. His wording, for Margaret's security and peace of mind." I was quiet for a long moment, my thumb rubbing the edge of the table. The sum was substantial, enough to change the course of someone's life or steady it, at least. But more than the money, it was the thought that Edward had accounted for this possibility, had made sure I wouldn't be left vulnerable. Gregory came by that evening, still in his work clothes, the dust of the construction site clinging to his sleeves. I poured him a cup of coffee and told him what Cynthia had said. His brow furrowed the moment I mentioned the figure. "I don't want it," he said quickly, leaning back in his chair. "It should all go to you and the kids. After everything, I can't take that money, it feels wrong." "It's not wrong," I said, steady but gentle. "It's justice. And it's what your father wanted. You've got a business to grow, employees to pay, and a home to maintain for those children. This will give you a foundation." Gregory shook his head, his jaw tightening. "I don't want Vanessa's money touching my life. I don't want to build anything on what she stole." I reached across the table and placed my hand over his. "Then don't think of it as hers. Think of it as what was taken from you being restored. That money was yours before she ever had her hands on it. And Edward, he would have wanted you to have the chance to stand without fear of falling again." His eyes dropped to the coffee, steam curling between us. "And your share?" he asked quietly. "I'll take it," I said, because I knew he'd push if I pretended otherwise. "Not because I need it, but because Edward intended it. It will give me the freedom to keep the house exactly the way it is, to make sure the children always have a place to land." We sat there in silence for a while, the air thick with the weight of the conversation. Finally, Gregory nodded, the tension in his shoulders easing just a fraction. "All right, I'll accept it, but only because you're telling me it's his wish." "It is," I said, "and someday, when the children are grown, they'll understand that this wasn't about money. It was about making sure we had the means to choose our own paths." Later that night, after Gregory left, I went to Edward's study and sat in his old leather chair. The lamp cast a warm pool of light over the desk, and for a moment, I could almost feel his presence. I thought about the years we'd spent building a life, the storms we'd weathered, and the quiet, deliberate way he had always looked after us. Even from beyond the grave, he'd managed to shield us from the worst of the fallout. The money wouldn't erase what had happened. It wouldn't change the betrayal or the damage Vanessa had done. But it was a reminder that we weren't starting from nothing, we had something to stand on. And that, I knew, was a kind of victory in itself. I closed my eyes, letting the hum of the house settle around me, and whispered into the stillness, "We're going to be all right, Edward. Just like you planned." The morning was cool, the kind of quiet chill that settles in your bones but feels clean, almost bracing. Gregory drove, his hands steady on the wheel, the road winding us toward the small hillside cemetery where Edward had been laid to rest. The clouds hung low, but there was no rain, just a muted silver light that seemed to make everything softer. We didn't speak much on the way. There was nothing awkward in the silence. It was simply full, the kind of silence that holds more than words could carry. When we pulled into the gravel path, Gregory parked under the old oak at the edge of the grounds. We walked the rest of the way together, the grass damp underfoot. Edward's headstone came into view, its dark granite polished to a muted shine. His name, the dates, and that line he had chosen himself. Truth is the only legacy worth leaving. Every time I saw it, the words caught me not because they were poetic, but because they were him, distilled into one sentence. Gregory stopped a few feet from the grave, his breath coming a little heavier, not from the walk but from what he'd been carrying. He stood there for a moment, his eyes fixed on the stone, and then he spoke. "Dad, I owe you an apology." His voice was low, the words catching in his throat. "I let her Vanessa turn me into something I never wanted to be. I doubted you. I doubted Mom. I let pride and lies get in the way. I should have been there more. I should have seen what she was doing. I'm sorry." I let him have the moment. His shoulders were tight, his head bowed slightly, and I could see the boy he'd once been, the one who used to sit in Edward's workshop, asking endless questions while pretending to help Sandwood. I stepped closer, resting a hand on his arm. "Gregory," I said softly, "he forgave you a long time ago." His eyes flicked to mine, doubtful. "How can you be so sure?" "Because I knew your father," I said. "And I knew the way he looked at you even when you made mistakes, even when you believed the wrong people. He believed you'd find your way back. That was his gift. He didn't hold on to bitterness. He believed truth always outlived lies, and love always outlasted anger." Gregory swallowed hard, glancing back at the headstone. "He always said the truth was like water, eventually it finds its way through. I guess I just took too long to see it." I shook my head. "No, you saw it when you were ready. And Edward understood that. Forgiveness was never conditional with him. It wasn't a reward you had to earn. It was just there, steady as the tide. We stood there together, the quiet broken only by the wind moving through the trees. I thought of all the mornings Edward and I had spent talking over coffee, of how he'd speak about Gregory not as a man who had disappointed him, but as a son still writing his own chapters. He'd been frustrated at times, yes, but never hopeless. Gregory knelt down, brushing away a leaf that had landed on the granite. "I'm going to make it right," he said. "Not just for me, but for the kids. I'm going to teach them what he taught me about building something that lasts, about telling the truth even when it's hard." I smiled, my eyes stinging but my voice steady. That's the best way to honor him. Not with flowers or speeches, but with a life that reflects what he stood for. He looked up at me, and there was something lighter in his expression. Not joy exactly, but relief, like setting down a weight you didn't realize you'd been carrying for years. Before we left, I laid my hand on the top of the stone, letting my palm rest against the cool surface. "We're all right, Edward," I murmured. "We've got each other, and your truth lives on." Gregory waited beside me until I was ready to turn away. As we walked back toward the car, I felt the peace of knowing that whatever wounds had been left between father and son, they'd been healed, not erased, but healed in the way that matters most. Truth and love had outlasted the rest. The sun was lowering itself into the horizon, spilling amber light across the back porch. Gregory and I sat at the small wrought iron table Edward and I had picked out years ago, its paint worn but still sturdy. Between us was a pot of Earl Grey, steam curling into the cool evening air. I poured us each a cup, the scent of bergamot mixing with the faint sweetness of honeysuckle drifting in from the fence line. Gregory leaned back in his chair, his eyes following the sky as it shifted from gold to rose. "You know," he said, "I've been thinking a lot about the future lately. Not just work life, the kids. What kind of world I'm leaving for them." I smiled. "That's a good thing to think about. Your father used to say the future isn't built by what you dream, it's built by what you do every day without fail." Gregory nodded, wrapping his hands around his cup. "I want them to have what Dad gave me when I was their age, a sense of safety. The feeling that no matter what happens out there, home is solid ground." He looked at me then, his voice softening. "Even when I lost sight of it, it was always there because of him. And you." I felt the warmth in my chest that came from hearing him speak without that shadow of defensiveness he used to carry. Edward would be proud of you, I said simply. Not just for what you've done these past months, but for what you're choosing to be now. He sipped his tea, then set the cup down carefully, as though weighing his words. I know I can't undo the past, but I can make sure my kids never doubt they're loved and secure. I can make sure they see integrity in action, not just in stories. The light shifted again, shadows stretching across the porch boards. I could see Edward in him in the way Gregory's jaw tightened when he made a promise, in the way his gaze didn't drift when he spoke of his children. You'll do it, I told him, because you mean it, and because you've lived what happens when trust is broken. That kind of knowledge, it changes a person. We sat quietly for a moment, letting the soft hum of crickets fill the space. Inside, the muffled sound of the children playing drifted through the open kitchen window. Laughter, a thud, the quick patter of feet on the hardwood. Then a small voice called out, urgent but not panicked. Daddy, can you help me? Gregory's chair scraped gently against the wood as he stood without hesitation. Be right there, he called, already moving toward the screen door. I watched him go, the ease in his stride, the absence of the hesitation that used to be there when fatherhood and obligation competed for his attention. The door swung shut behind him, and I could hear his voice inside warm, patient, guiding. I stayed on the porch, letting the fading light wrap around me. The air was cooler now, the tea lukewarm in my cup, but I didn't mind. My eyes drifted toward the far end of the yard, where Edward used to stand with his hands in his pockets, surveying whatever small project he'd been tinkering with. And for a moment, I could almost feel him there beside me, not in a haunting way, but in that steady, grounding way that had always been his gift. The sense that things were as they should be, that the cracks had been mended, not perfectly, but honestly. I thought of the months behind us, the confrontation, the arrests, the nights of worry for the children and how far we'd come. It wasn't just survival, it was reclamation. The family, fractured and bruised, had found its way back to the table, back to truth. Gregory's laughter drifted through the window now, mingled with his daughter's giggles. The sound carried something light in it, something unburdened. I closed my eyes and let it settle in my bones. Yes, Edward, I whispered, the words barely leaving my lips. We're whole again.